We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Daled Amud Aleph and Maseches Avodah Zarah. This is Avodah Zarah Daf 54a. The Gemara continues. Amar Chizkiah. Chizkiah says, "Ma'ikra." Where do we see this in the pasuk? Rashi explains, "Ma'ikra de mizbeach have avonim harbe." The Gemara said in the previous Amud that a mizbeach is made out of many stones. Where do we see that in the pasuk? And furthermore, v'isuro achi note tzuruba, and we say that it's prohibited until it's mostly destroyed. And when the majority is destroyed, then it no longer has the status of a mizbeach of Avodah Zarah. But as long as the majority is not destroyed, it still has that status. Where do we see that in the pasuk? And the Gemara continues and says that we see that in a pasuk in Sefer Yeshayahu. The pasuk says, "Besumo kol avnei mizbeach ka'avnei gir minu patzos." It says when all of the stones of the mizbeach are completely broken up. So then it says, "Lo yakumu asherim v'chamonim." Then it says that they're not going to rise as idols, essentially. And so therefore, again, you see that when the majority of the stones, and stones in plural, when they are broken, that's when it no longer has the status of a mizbeach of Avodah Zarah. As the Gemara continues, "Iyika ka'avnei gir minu patzos." If the stones are completely broken, "Lo yakumun asherim v'chamonim." Then they are not going to rise as asherim. Again, they're not going to be as idols. And the Bach has a girsa here of v'ilo, and if not, if the majority is not destroyed, then yakumu, they will rise, meaning to say it is still considered as a mizbeach for Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara continues, Tana was taught in a Braisa Nevad, if you have an animal that was worshipped as Avodah Zarah, Shelo Aser, if it belongs to him, then it is forbidden. V'shal Chaveiro Mutter, and if it belongs to his friend, then it is mutter, it is permitted. And Rashi explains, Nevad bebalei chayim haneser legavo. We're talking here about animals, again, that they're worshipped as Avodah Zarah, and then they become prohibited to use for HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the Mizbeach. So, im shelo haya k'sheshtacha velo. If it belonged to him when he bowed to the animal, then also, then it does become forbidden. But im lav, but if it didn't belong to him at the time that he bowed to it, eino neser legavoa, then it is not going to become forbidden legavoa. It will not be forbidden on the Mizbeach to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Gemara continues, Urimini, we have a contradiction from the following Braisa, and this is from the Tosefta. Ezeo Nevad, what's considered to be Nevad? Kolsha ov demoso, any animal that you worship it, Bein b'shogeg uvein b'mezid, whether by mistake or on purpose, Bein ba'ones uvein b'ratzon, whether it's by accident or willingly. And Rashi notes, Mezid v'ratzon chadahav, really Mezid and ratzon are the same thing. Alatana ratzon etzel ones, you just use the word ratzon when you have the word ones over there. In any case, the Gemara continues and clarifies this Braisa. Hai ones hechi dami, what do we mean in this Braisa when we say that it was worshipped ba'ones, it was worshipped by accident? Lav kagon do onas behemas chaveiro, isn't the case that the person stole the animal of his friend, v'shtachav he bowed to it, and so you see, even if you bow to an animal that does not belong to you, it makes it prohibited to use it lagavo, you can't bring it on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara says, Amar Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama says, Lo, no, that's not what it means when we say ones. Rather, kagon sha'ansu ovdei kochavim. What we're talking about is that ovdei kochavim, idolaters, forced him to serve the animal. It was his own animal. And he bowed down to his own animal, and so therefore that has nothing to do with the situation of nevad of chavero. But the Gemara continues and asks, Ma'askif lo Rabbi Zeir. Rabbi Zeir asks on this, Ones Rachmana Patre, if it was ba'ones, if he was forced to serve it, so the Torah says he's exempt in such a situation. That shouldn't be considered a nevad, it shouldn't be considered being worshipped. T'chsiv, like it's written, V'lanara lo sa'asa davar, it says you don't do anything to the young woman, talking here about a situation of ones, a situation of rape, that she's not considered to be responsible, she's considered to be exempt because of the fact that it was an ones. And so the Gemara continues, Elam Rava, rather Rava says, Hakol hayu bichlal lo of them. Everybody was included in the pasuk. It says, "Don't worship them." And when the pasuk specifies and says you should live by the mitzvahs, you shouldn't die by the mitzvahs. Yotza ones. So if it's an accident, that's excluded. You're no longer responsible. However, v'hadar kasav rachmana. Then the pasuk writes, that you can't desecrate. You can't create a chil Hashem. The afilo bonus, that sounds like even if it's an accident, it's problematic. So hakeitzad, how so? How do we resolve the contradiction? Habetzina v'habefarhesia. In one case, we're talking when it's done privately. In the other case, we're talking when it's done publicly. And Rashi explains, Hakol hayu, everything was included in the Isser to serve Avodah Zarah, meaning Bein ba'ones, Bein ratzon, whether it's by accident or willingly, it's all included. However, we also have a pasuk that implies that a person is not responsible for ones, and so the Gemara answered, Befarhesi, if it's done in public, Lo sechalu, then it can't be a chil Hashem. V'haida katani ones aser befarhesia. That's when we say there's a problem of chil Hashem, and if it's done by accident, it's aser. That's if it is befarhesia. And so you do have a situation where if the worship of the animal was done ba'ones, it would be considered Avodah Zarah, and it would be prohibited legavoa, again in a situation of farhesia. And the Gemara continues, Amru le Rabbanan l'Rava, the Rabbanan said to Rava, Tanya de Messiah lach, we have a brisa that supports what you're saying, that again, if the Avodah Zarah is worshipped ba'onas, but it's befarhesia, that is considered to be Avodah Zarah, and it would be prohibited l'gavo in a case of nevad. The brisa says as follows, B'musiyos shalovdei kochavim, the platforms of Avodah Zarah, b'shas ha'gezeira, or some have the girsa b'shas ha'shmad, in a time when there's decrees against the Jewish people. Aval pisha gezeira b'teila, even if the gezeira is no longer, even if the decree is no longer, osan bimusios lo batlu. Those bimusios, those platforms, they are not nullified. They still have the status of Avodah Zarah. And so you see over here, it's obviously being worshipped bionis. It's being done by accident, but since it's a shas hashmad and it's befarhesia, that's why it's considered to be Avodah Zarah. Amar Lui said to them, the Rava responded to the Rabbanan, Imi Shemha, if it's just from that brisa lo tesayin, that's not really a support for us, because Amor Yisrael Mumar, some have the gears of Meshumet Have, Upalach LaBaratzon. Maybe we were talking about a Jew who was an apostate who actually worshipped it Baratzon willingly. We don't know whether it was worshipped by accident or not. It might have been willingly, and therefore it could be that's the reason why it has a status of Avodah Zarah in that situation. And Rashi explains Shas Gezeira Farhesiyahu, again, that's in public, Vionasu, and it's something that is forced, it's coerced. And again, the Gemara said it's not necessarily Bionas, and therefore it is not necessarily a proof to what Rav is saying. And the Gemara continues, Rav Ashi says, Lo Tema Amar, don't say that maybe it's possible that there was a Jewish apostate that served. Elavada Yisrael Mumar Haver, there certainly was at least one Jew who was a Mumar, who was an apostate, Upalach La Baratzon, and he served it Baratzon, he served it willingly. And Rashi explains, Vada Yisrael Mumar, again it could be Meshumad, certainly there was a Jewish apostate. Di Efshar Bechola Ovdin, Shalo Yehebo an Echad Mumar. It can't be that everybody who worshipped this Avodah Zarah, that there's not one Mumar. Achareisha Roes Yisrael Yada Mata Nota Libo Lavos Kochavim. Once a person sees that Klal Yisrael has the lower hand, so then already somebody is going to turn towards Avodah Zarah. It's impossible that there was not at least one, and therefore we can assume that it was done willingly at least once. And the Gemara continues with another answer to the contradiction in the Brisas above in terms of whether an animal that belongs to someone else can have the status of a nevad. Chizkiya Amar Chizkiya says, Kegon shenisach la'avodas kochavim yayin al karneh. The case over here was that he poured a libation of wine to an avodah zarah on the horns of the animal. And Rashi explains, Chizkiya Amar Chizkiya says, Liolam ones de katani, really when it says onus in that brisa, sha'onas behemes chavero, it does mean that he stole the animal of his friend, and it has the status of a nevad. But nevertheless, the two brisas are not contradictory. The Hadatani Asr, the one that says that it's forbidden, he poured a libation of wine to the Avodah Zarah between the horns of the animal of his friend. The point is, the Ovid Maisa, he did an actual Maisa with the animal itself, and that certainly will be Asr, as we're going to see later on. And the Gemara continues and asks, Maskif lo Ravada Barava. Ravada Barava asks on this answer of Chizkiya, Hi Nevad, who would that be called a Nevad, an animal that's worshipped? Hi Bimus Bialmahu, there the animal is just like a platform for the Avodah Zarah. V'shari would actually be permitted. And Rashi explains, V'hai Nevad havoi bitmia, there's a question. Nevad lo kari el sha'asa es habema atzma avodas kochavim. A Nevad is when the animal itself is the Avodah Zarah, not that it's a means to serve the Avodah Zarah. V'hai Bimus Bialma Shavia, this is just like a platform that you put the Avodah Zarah on, it's just being used for Avodah Zarah. Ubalei Chaim lo mitzri mishum meshamshe avodas kochavim, and the halacha is that animals actually do not become prohibited as being used for Avodah Zarah, so therefore this really is not a good answer to say that he poured to an Avodah Zarah through the karnos, through the horns of the animal. And so the Gemara instead says, the Gemara revises the answer, Ella rather, Amar Ravada Barava says, Kegon shenisach lo yayin bein karneha, what happened was that he poured a libation of wine between its horns, and he was worshipping the animal itself in that fashion. Diavad b'maisa, and there was a maisa being done with the animal. He actually touched the animal in the process. It wasn't simply bowing down to the animal. V'chihada asa ula am Rabbi Yochanan. It's like when Ula came and he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, lo asra, even though they say that if one bows to the animal of his friend, he doesn't cause it to be prohibited. Asa b'maisa asra, but if he does an actual action with the animal, so then he does cause it to be prohibited. And Rashi explains, he made the animal in Avodah Zarah, and he did an action with the animal. But let's say we just bow to the animal, or or some other avodah that's not with the body of the animal, then he would not be able to prohibit something that does not belong to him. And the Gemara continues, Amar Lahu Rav Nachman said to them, Poku v'yomru le'ula, go out and say to Ula, Kvar tirgam Rav Huna l'shmaitach beBavel, that Rav Huna, he already explained your teaching in Bavel as follows, the Amar Rav Huna, because Rav Huna said, Haisa bemas chaveiro, Ravutza b'fnei avodas kochavim, let's say the animal of his friend is crouched before the avodah zara, Kevon shashachat ba simen echad, once he slaughtered one simen, either the food pipe or the windpipe, Asra, then he prohibits it, and the idea is that it's the same idea as what we just said above, as what Ula just said above, that even though if one bows to the behemas chaveiro, the animal of his friend, he doesn't prohibit it, but if he does a maisa, if he does an action in the body of the animal, he does prohibit it, and that's true over here as well in Rav Huna's statement. If he does a maisa in the animal itself, so then he prohibits the animal. And the Gemara continues, Menol on the asra, so from where do we know that by doing this action on the animal itself, he makes it forbidden? Ilema mi kohanim, if you're going to say from the kohanim, we'll see Rashi in a moment. V'dil mashani kohanim divnei deyoninu, maybe when it comes to the kohanim, they're different because they have das, they have understanding. V'ela me'avnei mizbeach, maybe you'll say the proof is from the stones of the mizbeach, but the Gemara says to that, V'dil ma'kid Rapapa, maybe that's like Rapapa that we mentioned earlier. And Rashi explains, Simen echad la'avodas kochavim, again, the case is where he slaughters the animal, he slaughters one simen for avodah zarah, and that does cause the animal to be prohibited, even though it's the animal of his friend. And the Gemara asks, where do we know that from? Inema mi kohanim, if you're going to say it's from the kohanim, this is sha'onsum malchi Yisrael, the kings of Israel, they force them, lasos komrim la'avodas kochavim, that they should be priests for the avodah zarah, so that also is a situation of ones. Uchsiv, and it's written, v'lo yigashu ela l'chayin li, it says that they're no longer allowed to be kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash. So you see that even though it's a situation of ones, they are prohibited from serving further in the Beis HaMikdash. And the same would be true in this situation, even though it's behemas chaveru, it's essentially ones, it's against his will, it would be prohibited in this case. But maybe it's different by the Kohanim. Divnei deyoninu, because by the Kohanim they have das, uknasu, and therefore it's a fine that's imposed against them. You can have a fine in a situation where the people who were involved, they have das. And so the Gemara then said, Me'avnei mizbeach, well maybe we can bring a proof from the stones of the mizbeach, shegonzum malchei beis chashmonoi, the kings of the chashmonoim, they stored them away, they said they couldn't be used, mishum deshiksum malchei yavan la'avodas kochavim, because the malchei yavan used them for avodah zarah, and therefore they can no longer be used in the Beis HaMikdash. This the Gemara discussed earlier. V'afagav de hektish haven. Now, even though those stones belong to hektish, v'lo yachal over kochavim lost, and really the over kochavim should not have been able to make them prohibited because it didn't belong to him. Afilu achi, nevertheless, came into ovad maisa, since there was a maisa done with the stones. So asrin hu rabbanan. So the rabbanan say that they're forbidden. But on that dilma kerapapa, maybe it's really like Rapapa. Diyamar krash kachu v'darish, because Rapapa said earlier that they found the pasuk sheyatzu l'chulin. That what actually happened is that these avnei mizbeach, they became profaned and they no longer belong to hektish. V'kanim ovdei kochavim v'yachlu lasron, and actually the ovdei kochavim did acquire them, and they were able to forbid them. It wasn't something that did not belong to them, and so therefore that would not be a proof. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Dalid Amud Beis.